The mysterious disappearance of China's foreign minister, Qin Gang, is a timely reminder that the future of U.S.-China relations will be determined not just by American policy and what's happening domestically in the United States, such as the presidential election campaign. It will also be shaped by developments in China, which at this point are opaque but troubling. From what outsiders can tell, China is reverting to a Mao-era style of politics that we have not seen for decades. More significant than Qin Gang's mysterious removal from power after the authorities attributed his absence to health reasons is the doctoring of websites and press releases to expunge his participation and achievements from the past. Who controls the past controls the future, George Orwell wrote in his novel 1984. And that ominous dictum seems to be the guide to China's elite politics these days. This is a far cry from the technocratic government that Deng Xiaoping ushered in as he reformed China in the 1980s. In those days, the Chinese political system seemed a contradiction in terms, a dictatorship that had age caps or term limits for high offices. Where else did one see this kind of limitation of authoritarian rule? Today, once again, there are no limits to the power of China's ruler. What the scholar Elizabeth Economy has called China's third revolution, the first personified by Mao, the second by Deng, and now by Xi, is still going strong. That third revolution is not just about domestic politics. Xi has consolidated his own power and put the Chinese Communist Party back at the center of society, but he has also sought to present a much stronger and more assertive China to the world. And those decisions have had ripple effects across the globe, especially in Asia, where China's neighbors have been rattled by Xi's more aggressive posture and policies. The U.S. has not handled relations with China perfectly. The Biden administration was needlessly confrontational from the outset, publicly upbraiding Beijing at their first meeting of senior officials. The U.S. has also maintained Donald Trump's tariffs on China, despite the fact that they've been expensive failures. Remember, it is American consumers who pay for those tariffs, not the Chinese. Trump provided tens of billions in additional subsidies to farmers just to make up for the losses they suffered because of these policies. And for a while, it seemed that American policies towards Beijing were being announced with no effort to maintain a working relationship with China, despite its status as the world's second largest economy, a nuclear weapons power with a UN veto. But Biden has corrected course. Several of his senior officials, including the Secretaries of State, Commerce, and the Treasury, have met with their Chinese counterparts and tried to stop the decline in relations between the two countries. Antony Blinken said to me in an interview that world leaders had been telling him that they expected the U.S. and China to build a decent working relationship. The administration is taking seriously the idea that it will restrict only a limited number of high-end technologies from being shared with China, using the metaphor of a small yard with a high fence. Even some American policies that would provoke Chinese opposition, such as looming new regulations around U.S. investment into China, are now being signaled to the Chinese in advance, in that particular case by Janet Yellen. There are still areas where the U.S. could make a more serious effort. If the Biden administration wants to have productive military-to-military dialogue, maintaining Trump-era sanctions on China's defense minister would seem an odd way to signal that desire. Far better to waive the sanctions so that two sides can talk and avoid misunderstandings on issues like Taiwan. But the ball is really in China's court. Unfortunately, Chinese policy has been marked by an assertiveness and even bellicosity that has broken sharply with the past 3 decades. Xi has staked out expansive claims for China in the South China Sea, increased military activity around Taiwan, clashed with India in the Himalayas, demanded that Australia cease any criticism of his country, pledged his country's unqualified support for Moscow even as Russia's aggression in Ukraine escalates, and he has ramped up criticism of the United States. None of these policies seem to be working. Countries around China have become far more active in countering Beijing's influence and searching for assistance elsewhere, especially with America. From Japan to the Philippines to India, nations are pushing back. Will Beijing recognize this and change? Is an increasingly autocratic and closed decision-making system capable of learning and adapting? Well, Qin Gang's mysterious removal does not suggest a positive answer. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week.
So we're recording this the day after Xi Jinping turned 70, but since Vladimir Putin has already wished his dear friend health and happiness, we can move past that occasion and get right to the substance of the topic today. Steve is the ultimate biographer of Stalin. You're completing your third volume of a magnificent and transfixing biography of the man, and Orville is the author of more books than I can rattle off here on China, past and present. But you're also both among the most trenchant and eloquent observers of these two contemporary figures and their effect on the world. So we really could have no better pair to make sense of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and their commonalities and differences and their relationship and what it all means. But I want to start by tracing the arc of American and Western understanding of the two figures. When you go back and look at profiles and speeches and memos from officials on both of them from their early years in power, you see this kind of powerful impulse among Americans, especially, to view both Xi and Putin as moderate, as modernizers, as Western-oriented, certainly as leaders we could basically get along with and who would by and large move their societies in a direction that seemed, roughly aligned with our interests and our values. So Orville, let's start with you. What was the early impression of Xi Jinping? What did it miss and how did it start to change as you reflect over the last 10 years or so of our interactions with him?
When Xi Jinping came to power, he was not somebody with whom we were tremendously familiar. We knew more about his father, and we rather blithely, and I think quite naively, assumed that because his father had undergone a lot of persecution and sort of political travails, that this might have rubbed off on his son in a way that would have made him somewhat jaundiced about the old one-party Leninist state and the whole revolution. And I remember writing a book concluding just as he was coming to office and cautiously wondering if he might not turn into a reformer. Well, he did not. So now we're left to try to figure out who exactly is he? And this is why I really welcome chatting with you, Steve, here, because I think, in any leader, there's history, there's ideology, and then there's the man. And all of those ingredients have to be factored into any kind of a sort of understanding of what drives them. And I can't think of a leader in Chinese history who is more opaque in this regard than Xi Jinping is, particularly the latter part, the psychological syndrome out of which he operates. I think it's really important, but very, very difficult to divine.
Just to linger on Xi Jinping's father for a second, say a bit more about who he was and how we thought that might have shaped Xi Jinping and how he thought about China.
Well, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, was somebody who, during the Cultural Revolution, had a very bitter experience. And like so many other people, was accused of being a counter-revolutionary anti-party element. And it was in that climate of sort of the Maoist, the most intense period of Mao's revolution, the Cultural Revolution, that Xi Jinping came of age. And there is a scholar at the American University, Joseph Turijan, who's been writing about his father and actually discovering some very interesting stuff. But we still are left to sort of divine, how did that impact his son? And I think the only thing that we can say is that when you're a teenager, and your father is pilloried, and of course you yearn to love and respect your parents, that casts a tremendous shadow on your life. And he got sent away to the countryside, to the family sort of Shanxi province, which is where the father came from. And then finally, at one point, he came back to Beijing, tried to escape his exile, and his mother berated him and send him back again. So we have here, at least insofar as we understand it, a tremendously complicated parental web of relations in which he grew up, having to, in a certain sense, despise his own father because he was considered a counter-revolutionary element, at the same time yearning to be part of what was going on, the Cultural Revolution, to be a Red Guard, to get into the Little Red Pioneers. And one telling fact is that he applied 8 times to become a Little Red Pioneer, which is a sort of the preceding party membership later on when you're older. And of course, he was eschewed and turned down because of his black category of family background. Finally, a friend of the family presided over the decision and he did get in. But you have to kind of wonder, how did that influence him? This idea that you have to be a sort of 200%er, more red than anyone else in order to be accepted. And then you're still not quite accepted and to survive.
Before we focus on this idea of, psychological syndrome, as you put it, Orville, Steve, let me turn to you to go back over this course of Western understanding of Putin. This is obviously slightly longer history, he's been in power longer, but as you look at what we thought we knew of Putin and what we got wrong and why, how do you understand that history of our own interpretation?
Orville mentioning the person who presided over Xi Jinping's admission to the pathway towards eventual Communist Party membership reminds us, Dan, of contingency. We always have very substantial, deep, long-term structural understandings of how things work. And yet in our own lives, there's been so much contingency, so much accident, randomness, intercession of people. And so we have to be careful to recuperate that contingency in our analyses. Having said that, let's linger for a minute on the structural factors that the contingency eventually trips. So with Xi Jinping, he doesn't claw his way to power. This is not something where he has been fighting internally battles and cleverness and just Machiavellianism and finally made his way to the top. He got tapped on the back of the shoulder, the way people get tapped on the back of the shoulder at Yale to run the United States. We need to understand this, and there's a parallel, Dan, with Gorbachev, which is why I bring this up. So Gorbachev is also this figure who is tapped by the KGB faction, by the powers that be, who are worried both about the corrosive corruption that's become completely pervasive in the Soviet system, and they're worried about the loss of dynamism in the Soviet economy, in the Cold War competition. And so they settle on a guy that they don't know that well, but they do know that he's not corrupt. They do know that he's a sort of true believer in the system. And his mandate is to tackle the corruption and re-energize the system. Same mandate as Xi Jinping. And a similar selection process, although hardly identical. And there's a sort of different interest groups and power relations and different time periods. So we want to be careful with the analogy, but the analogy works to a certain extent. And so the big difference is that Gorbachev has happened, so that when Xi Jinping is tapped, the Gorbachev attempt to re-energize the system, to get back to dynamism, ends in liquidation, self-liquidation, in implosion. And so if Xi Jinping is going to do anything, he's not going to do Gorbachev. That's 100% clear. Clear as day. Whatever lessons he learned from his dad and whatever lessons he learned from his own experience in the Cultural Revolution and whatever happened behind the scenes, and we may never know that. But the key point here is that he comes in, Xi Jinping comes in, unlike Gorbachev, where Gorbachev's already happened, and the lesson is profound and clear. And so the party is dedicated to a non-repeat of Gorbachev. So the whole story is, what is their analysis of the Soviet collapse? Not what is our analysis necessarily, not what do we think happened or didn't happen, but what does Xi Jinping think happened or didn't happen? Let's remember that Xi Jinping was also running the party school before he got the big job. And so the two biggest topics at the party school were Soviet collapse and never to repeat in China, and then Western decadence and et cetera. The U.S. is in decline and all of that mythology that they are marinated in at the party school. But the number one topic, Dan, is no Gorbachev, no political opening, no political reform, no suicide of Communist Party rule. And so if you knew this, if you were aware of this, you saw that there were limits to the possibility of political opening and reform under Xi Jinping. I wrote a book on the Soviet collapse, a short book, in which I made the argument about how there's no political reform equilibrium in communism. And once you begin a reform, you open up the party for liberalization. People want other parties. They don't want the Communist Party. So the Communist Party is left with this problem that it can't open up, it can't politically liberalize and maintain its monopoly. It either has to crack down on political opening, or it has to go all the way in Gorbachev fashion and the thing unravels. And so for me, the history of the party and Xi Jinping's understanding of the history of the party were absolutely central to what we needed to be thinking about.
And Steve, China did have its sort of near Gorbachev moment, didn't it, in 1989, when reforms started unraveling the Leninist structure. And you will remember that one of the most embarrassing moments for the Chinese Communist Party in 1989 was that Gorbachev was supposed to come to Beijing and they were going to bury the hatchet. And Gorbachev did actually come to Beijing, and he couldn't go to Tiananmen Square to be received with proper pomp and circumstance. They had to meet him at the airport. And all the way into the city, there were people holding such signs as, "Where is China's Gorbachev?" So for a good Chinese Leninist, this was a wake-up moment, and I think it's very interesting. I've never seen anybody say anything about where Xi Jinping was during 1989, what his disposition was towards those demonstrations. But whatever he did, I think the message he ultimately took home was, we're not going there.
There's that famous line, Orwell, that that Deng supposedly told one of his children that he thinks Gorbachev is an idiot.
Well, I think if you're a good Leninist, that's not an illogical conclusion, is it?
Yeah, the irony, of course, is that Gorbachev was himself a Leninist and thought that there was a better Lenin, a more pluralistic, non-Stalinist or pre-Stalinist Lenin, which was a fiction, which was an illusion, but it was his North Star, and he followed it, as a result of which communism died more or less peacefully in the Soviet case. And then there was the non-fantasy version of Leninism that Deng Xiaoping had. And of course, Deng did purge the party of the fantasy Leninists, the ones who thought reform and opening was possible in a political sense, not an economic or a foreign policy sense.
I mean, I do think, we don't want to forget that during the halcyon decade of the 1980s, when we thought there was a fair wind blowing towards reform and opening, and China might slowly integrate into the world system and become more soluble, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a very exhilarating, exciting time when many of us actually thought there was a prospect that this Communist Party might make some kind of a peaceful transition to something else. But we should remember that in 1981, just as the reforms were hitting the high tide in China, Deng Xiaoping came out with something that he called the 4 basic principles. And everybody's just thought, oh, well, this is sort of communist rhetoric. But what were they all about? They were all about the party. And he wanted to remind people that whatever the hell was going on, we're not getting rid of this one-party Lenin. But one thing I want to ask you about, Steve, is this. I mean, one element of, both Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping, and I'm wondering about Putin, is this idea of a restoration of greatness, rejuvenation, and in China's case, the China dream. But I think Putin also has such a dream, maybe a bit more inchoate and less spelled out, but it seems to me this is one thing they do share in common.
Let me just add to that question, Steve. You trace this history of Xi, but it does seem like there are some commonalities with Putin. He was also kind of tapped, not exactly out of nowhere, but he was not the obvious heir apparent. He, at least in the mythology that most of us get, he was very much foreign by the experience of watching the Soviet Union fall, just as Xi Jinping presumably was. So in addition to that sense of lost greatness, how did that sense of humiliation and shame of that period shape him?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There are similarities besides age between the two, Xi Jinping and Putin. They're both 70. They had sort of hard scrabble youths. Their growing up was not luxurious, to put it mildly. And yet they rose somehow to positions of authority thanks to these circumstances and others who facilitated their career. And Putin was appointed more or less because he vowed to protect the Boris Yeltsin family, as it was called, the family in the kind of mafia sense of the state, that if Yeltsin stepped down, he wouldn't go to prison. And at the same time, Putin would fix the chaos, the anarchy of the Russian state, because the Soviet collapse in Russia didn't end in 1991, as I argued in my book. It continued all throughout the 90s. And so Putin's mandate, as it were, was to protect the Yeltsin family, but also to arrest the continued decline, implosion that Russia had inherited from the Soviet case. And so that life experience of the collapse is also very, very imminent for him, just as for Xi Jinping, right? Xi Jinping has a different experience in the Chinese countryside, and Orville's already alluded to this. Putin is in the second capital, St. Petersburg, but he's in a communal apartment, a rough and tumble courtyard. There's the experience of World War II and the Nazi siege of Leningrad, where nearly 1 million people starve to death or die of disease resulting from their starvation. And so all of that is the crucible, as it were, in which Putin rises. And then he gets into the KGB, as we know, the same way that Xi Jinping got into the party track, which was to knock on the door. They tapped him, but ultimately he was looking for it, and that must have gotten around. He doesn't have a distinguished career in the KGB, just like Xi Jinping doesn't have an incredibly distinguished career as a provincial leader. And then Putin is in Germany, right there on the front line of the Cold War, when the wall implodes and Moscow is absent, as he said, not giving instructions over the phone. And so he experiences that calamity, the end of the Soviet forward position in Eastern Europe firsthand. And that's extremely formative for him. And so resurrection of the state, resurrection of the system in some fashion, not the communist system, because that's gone and not recuperable, but resurrection of a Russian state and a great power status, because the Soviet Union was not just a single party monopoly communist state. It was also a great power. But here we need to expand the purview a little bit. You know, we have the Leninist picture. Leninism is a very specific form of organization, and we need to spend a little bit more time on what that is. But we've got that picture partially introduced. But the other picture is the Eurasian land empire or multiple millennia of history. And so what you've got here is an upstart version of power that's very modern, and that's the world we live in, which is the British Empire, a big navy, trade, especially trade with other advanced countries that have high tech and high valuated products, and a kind of open market economy based on trade and based on a navy with limited government in some form, right? Limits on executive power. And this model is unbelievably powerful, and it's a kind of upstart. You can see it with the Dutch, who have a version of it, but it's really the British, and the British defeat the French in a more or less 100-year war that culminates in the defeat of Napoleon. And then the British from 1815, they refashion the world in their image as a world where littoral states have an advantage and land-based empires are at a disadvantage. They're autocratic, they have land armies, and they don't trade with other advanced countries. They're often commodity exporters, where they don't develop their own high tech and they don't acquire the high tech the same way. They're losing a game that for a long time they won, right? For a very long time, the land-based empires had the riches, had the system until this British upstart. And then, of course, the Americans inherit that British power and the Americans transform it. And so we have these two forms of power, one an upstart and one at least a millennium long. And the upstart one's got the upper hand. And so we see these autocratic, ancient civilization, land empires of Eurasia fighting back. And they fight back on the ground that they're strongest, which is to say history, which is to say civilization, right? Huntington didn't get it right when he said there would be a clash of civilizations that would arise naturally. What he did get right was the Clash of Civilizations handbook would be available for these countries to try to realize a Huntington vision, to pitch themselves as civilizations, not just countries, and to try to talk about that golden age and how that golden age is being stolen from them by Western imperialism, first the British or the Dutch, and now the Americans, and how no one has the right to rule them. And they're sovereign, and they're much greater, and they're much older. And who put the Americans in charge of the world? When in fact, the Americans barely exist when it compares to Russian history or Chinese history. We could say the same for Persian history. We see a version of this in Turkey, Dan. We see a version of this in India. And so it's very interesting to see this clash and for them to object to the world as it's configured, the last 2 centuries, but especially since 1945, and to try to reclaim their self-assigned place, their sense of being more ancient, more legitimate, more impressive. And so for us, we need to think about how the Chinese Communist Party does not own Chinese civilization. And so being able a little bit to separate the civilization from the regime rather than to allow the conflation. That's true in the Russia case. It's true in the Iranian case. The mullahs don't represent Persian civilization through the centuries. Vladimir Putin does not equal Russian civilization and its achievements. And Xi Jinping and the Communist Party don't as well. But once you put this Eurasian landmass autocracy, land-based empire, and extortion or expropriation or repression together as a package, you see that they're fighting a losing game, which is one of the reasons we see them teaming up.
Orville, does Xi Jinping's view of history align with that? When you talk about that sense of reclaimed greatness and how it relates to humiliation in his own life experience and his country's, how does he trace that narrative?
Here, I think there is something that Xi Jinping and Putin actually share. And that is, we forget that, Leninism is all about how to build a strong, well-organized one-party structure and state. But there was another aspect of Lenin, and that was his theories on imperialism. That, the developed world, in order, the higher stage of capitalism is you have to export all your excesses abroad and colonize and exploit lesser peoples to keep the whole capitalist edifice going. And of course, out of Lenin is anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, all of these kinds of things from the 19th and early 20th century came the whole culture of victimization. This is something that, of course, China has taken to a very high stage. But I think it was also very deeply implicit in the way Russia looks at the world, that you're disrespected, you're occupied, you're disesteemed, you have your victories, but still. And this, I think, really is one place where Putin and Xi, I think, connect quite closely. They both feel shut out and marginalized. And there's an expression in Chinese, it makes me laugh every time I hear it. And the foreign ministry uses it a lot. It's Shanghai 中国人民的感情. It means you've hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, as if the Chinese people were some throbbing mass of weakness that you're constantly offending. But so I think that comes from Lenin, because he's the guy who set up the us and them, the colonializers, the imperializers, and then the victims, the people who were preyed upon and oppressed and exploited and marginalized, mistreated. And so this is a very deep thing that ties them together, and they want to be respected, and yet they don't act respectably. So they're in a terrible loop, and yet they're constantly offended. And I think this drives them in a very powerful way together. And it just simply infuriates them, because we cannot and will not and are unable to say, oh, well, fine, you're a little autocracy. You've done a lot. You've pulled a lot of people out of misery. It's all good. Let's just not criticize you. Well, that's not going to happen. But so there's that deep-rooted victim culture that came out, I think, of the Leninist narrative, which both have deeply imbibed.
And Dan, here we have the ultimate irony, because Marxism, Leninism, it's Western. It's a Western import. So here everything is anti-Western. Everything is about keeping out the pollution of the West, the decadence of the West, the amoralism of the West, and all the other things that they accuse the West of. but in the name of Western ideology. Right? I mean, Marx was not Chinese, although certainly you could think that if you spent some time in a party school there. So on this point about the anti-imperialism, imperialism happened. The Chinese were abused. The British were narco-traffickers. They did the Opium War, forcing opium into China. All of that happened. We know that history, and we write about that history. We're not in denial of that history. The part that China is in denial of are the depredations that Communist Party rule caused domestically. What the British did in China is inexcusable. But what the British did in China doesn't begin to scratch the surface of what Mao did in China. Mao put numbers up on the board that Hitler never put up on the board, let alone the British, right? So we're talking about a very selective view of history. And the further point that they're right that Western imperialism was very nefarious for China. And yet, okay, we'll talk about that, but let's also talk about what your own communist system has done to your country. And if you want to talk about that, open up your archives. We may never see the Communist Party archives of China the way we have in the Soviet case. I've been very privileged to take advantage. China scholars don't have that same privilege, that same fortune, where the regime has imploded and the archives became widely available. But I guarantee you, Dan, the secret of the Chinese Communist Party archives, if it's ever revealed one day, is that they're communists. That's the secret of the Soviet archives.
I remember vividly walking down the Avenue of Eternal Peace during, I guess it was National Day or whatever, and they'd have pictures of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, giant painted portraits up, and you think, oh my Lord, where's the anti-foreignism here? And I might also say that, having spent decades living within this sort of victim culture of China that was elaborated out of Leninism, you go to Vietnam or Holland or even Burma or Cambodia or India. I mean, here's some places that were really colonized. China was only partially colonized, and I don't make any excuses for that. But the fact that they have managed to retain this idea of a century of humiliation, even when they are so demonstrably succeeding, is very striking. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that appeals to them about this idea of insisting, even when they are one of the great success stories of global history, on